For nearly 25 years, my world has revolved around numbers, digging through spreadsheets, following trails across ledgers, and catching the smallest intentional mistakes people thought were buried forever. As a forensic accountant, you learn one unshakable truth very early. Numbers don't lie. They simply can't. They have no ego, no greed, and no sense of entitlement. People, however, are an entirely different matter. They treat the truth like something elastic, stretching it, twisting it, and reshaping it until it fits whatever version of reality they want to believe. I've watched CEOs break down over missing millions, and I've seen small business owners risk everything for a few $1,000s they never earned. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the moment when the audit isn't about a stranger. It's about your own family. In my world, an unbalanced ledger is a sign of a deeper structural failure. It's the red flag that tells you the foundation is rotting. I know exactly how to trace a wire transfer through 6 offshore accounts, and I can spot a forged signature on a corporate contract from across a room. It's a skill that requires a cold heart and a sharp eye. But what they don't tell you in the certification exams is how to maintain that coldness when the ink on the page belongs to your father, and the hand that faked it belongs to your brother. My father, Samuel Miller, was a man of absolute transparency. He was a clockmaker by trade, a man who believed that if a second was lost, the whole day was a lie. He raised me and my brother Julian to understand that time and truth are the only things you can't get back once you waste them. He spent his life ensuring that every gear turned perfectly, every spring was wound just right. But as he got older, the machinery of his own life began to fail. I was the one who sat by his bed in that quiet house in Columbus, Ohio, listening to the rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks while he drifted away. I was the one who calculated his meds and balanced his final bills. I thought I was keeping his legacy safe. I didn't realize that while I was honoring the man, my brother was already trying to rewrite the ledger. Welcome back. Get settled, because this story isn't just about a legal dispute. It's about the total moral bankruptcy of someone I trusted. Before we dive into the audit of a lifetime, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It costs nothing, but it helps us share these stories of accountability and justice. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how far these messages travel. My name is David Miller. I'm 48 years old, and for 20 years, I've worked as a senior forensic accountant here in Columbus, Ohio. I deal in hard facts, verified signatures, and the cold reality of a balance sheet. I thought I had accounted for every risk in my father's estate. I thought the blood in our veins was a solid enough bond to ensure integrity. I was wrong. I missed the largest discrepancy of my career, my brother Julian. And as I'm about to show you, when the numbers don't add up, someone always pays the price. My father, Samuel Miller, didn't just build clocks. He built a reputation for being the most honest man in Ohio. In my profession, we call that goodwill. It's an intangible asset that you can't see on a balance sheet, but is worth more than the liquid capital in the bank. He lived his life with a zero-variance policy. If he said a job would take 6 hours, it took 360 minutes. Not a second more, not a second less. Growing up under his roof was like living inside a perfectly calibrated chronometer. I absorbed that precision. I turned it into a career where I hunt for discrepancies. My brother Julian, however, was a different kind of entry in the family ledger. Julian is 3 years younger than me, and from the time he could walk, he was a master of the creative adjustment. He didn't see rules as structural supports. He saw them as suggestions that could be negotiated. While I was studying for my CPA exams, Julian was bouncing from one groundbreaking startup to another, usually funded by a short-term loan from our father that never quite made it to the repayment phase. In accounting terms, Julian was a permanent liability, a recurring expense that provided zero return on investment. But my father, in his infinite grace, viewed Julian not as a bad debt, but as a project that just needed more time to mature. When the diagnosis came, stage 4 lung cancer, the family dynamic underwent a forced audit. A crisis has a way of showing you exactly where the bad assets are located. For 18 months, I was the one who managed the hospice care. I was the one who sat in the sterile hospital rooms, tracking his oxygen levels with the same focus I used to track corporate embezzlement. I organized his estate, handled the medical billing, and ensured that his final days were spent in the dignity of the home he'd built on Maplewood Drive. And Julian? Julian was a ghost. He was always just about to close a deal in Florida or stuck in a meeting in Chicago. He'd call once every 2 weeks, his voice filled with a rehearsed sincerity that wouldn't pass a basic audit. "I'm so sorry, Dave. I'll be there next weekend. Tell Dad I love him." He used the phrase "I love you" as a currency to buy more time for his own convenience. He wasn't there for the long nights of coughing or the crushing silence of a dying man's room. He only showed up when the machinery finally stopped. He arrived for the funeral looking like a man who had lost everything, but as a forensic accountant, I could see he was already calculating the value of the house before the dirt had even settled on the grave. The funeral at the cemetery in Upper Arlington was exactly what I expected. It was a cold, gray afternoon, the kind of Ohio winter day that feels like a heavy wool blanket soaked in water. Julian was there, front and center, wearing a suit that I'm fairly certain he bought with one of the emergency checks our father had written him last month. He was performing the role of the grieving son with an intensity that would have made a Shakespearean actor blush. He was dabbing his eyes, leaning on the arms of distant relatives and sighing loudly enough for the back row to hear. I stood 10 feet away, my hands in my overcoat pockets, watching the scene like a site inspector at a suspicious demolition. I wasn't crying, not because I didn't love my father, but because I had spent the last 18 months mourning him while he was still alive. My grief was quiet, professional, and already processed. Julian's grief was a marketing campaign for a product that didn't exist. 3 hours later, we were in the office of Robert Henderson, an estate attorney whose wood-paneled walls and leather-bound books suggested a level of stability that our family was about to lose. Julian sat on the edge of his chair, leg bouncing, eyes darting toward the manila folder on Henderson's desk. I sat back, observing the load-bearing changes in the room. I've seen this tension before in corporate offices. It's the look a treasurer gives right before an audit reveals a $1 million hole in the accounts. "Samuel was very clear about his final wishes," Henderson began, his voice a low, practiced monotone. "He came in 2 weeks before his passing to update the codicil of his will. My heart didn't race. It just registered a data point. 2 weeks before his passing? My father couldn't even hold a pen for more than 10 seconds without his hand trembling from the medication. He hadn't left his bedroom in a month." Henderson opened the folder and began to read. The house on Maplewood Drive, the house I had maintained with my own money, the one my father's heart was buried in, was left entirely to Julian. The investment accounts, the savings, the collection of rare antique clocks, all Julian. I was left with a small life insurance policy that wouldn't even cover the funeral costs and the gratitude of a father for a son's service. Julian let out a small, choked sob. "He knew I needed the help," he whispered, looking at the floor. "He always took care of me." Henderson slid the document across the mahogany desk. "He signed it right here, David. I know this might be a surprise." I leaned forward and picked up the paper. In my line of work, we have a saying, "The hand can lie, but the muscle memory never does." I looked at the signature at the bottom. To a layman, it looked like my father's script. But I wasn't a layman. I noticed the stop-start hesitation in the flow of the ink. The pressure on the downward stroke was too consistent for a man with failing motor skills. Most importantly, the loop of the M in Miller was closed at the bottom, a habit my father had broken 40 years ago, but one that Julian had always kept in his own handwriting. It was a discrepancy, a massive, glaring audit failure right in front of me. I could have pointed it out right then. I could have called for a graphologist. But I don't react. I respond. I looked at Julian. He was watching me through the corner of his eye, waiting for the explosion. I simply set the paper back on the desk. "It's very clear," I said quietly. I watched Julian's shoulders drop as he exhaled, a smug, barely perceptible smile touching his lips. He thought he had successfully cooked the books. He didn't realize that I was just letting him finish the entry so I could start the full-scale audit of his life. We stepped out of Robert Henderson's office and into the biting chill of the Columbus afternoon. The air was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the coldness radiating from my brother. Julian wasn't just walking, he was strutting. The material fatigue of his fake grief had completely vanished, replaced by the high-voltage energy of a man who thought he'd just pulled off the heist of the century. He stopped by his car, a leased Mercedes that I knew was 3 months behind on payments, and looked at me with a smirk that was a total structural failure of his character. "Look, Dave," he started, leaning against the door with a casualness that made my skin crawl. "I know it's a lot to take in, but Dad was in a different headspace at the end. He saw things for what they really were. He saw how much I've been struggling to get my ventures off the ground, and he realized you already have everything. You have the firm, the house in the suburbs, the perfect life. You don't need the legacy. I do. I stood there, my hands in my pockets, watching him. Like an engineer, I wasn't reacting, I was responding. A reaction would have been calling him a thief to his face. A response was letting him talk until he gave me the evidence I needed. You think he really wanted this, Julian? I asked, my voice as flat as a balanced ledger. 2 weeks before he died, when he could barely hold a glass of water, you're saying he decided to rewrite 30 years of planning? Julian's face shifted. The smirk didn't leave, but his eyes hardened. The entitlement that had been brewing in him for decades finally boiled over. I deserved more than you, David. That's the truth of it. You were always the perfect son, the one with the grades and the career. Dad spent his whole life looking at you with pride, while I was just the liability. This is my back pay. This is the interest on all those years of being second best. I earned this by simply being the one who stayed fun, the one who didn't make him feel like a project that needed auditing. It was a staggering admission. In his mind, his lack of integrity was actually a virtue. He honestly believed that stealing the family home and our father's life work was a market correction for his own insecurities. He looked at me, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the fight that would give him the chance to play the victim. But I didn't give it to him. I simply nodded. If that's how you feel, Julian, I said, my voice quiet, then I guess the house is yours. I won't contest the signature today. You won. I hope it's everything you thought it would be. The look on his face was priceless. It was the confusion of a man who had prepared for a war and found the gates wide open. He let out a short, triumphant laugh. Good. I'm glad you're finally being mature about something, Dave. I'll be moving in on Monday. Figure it out. As he drove away, I didn't feel defeated. I felt the specific satisfaction of an auditor who has just seen the suspect sign a full confession. He thought he had the house, the clocks, and the cash. He didn't realize that by winning today, he had just triggered a total audit of his life that he would never survive. I spent the next 3 weeks in a state of high-level surveillance. In my profession, we don't look for the big, obvious lie. We look for the small, repeated inconsistencies, the micro-discrepancies that indicate a systemic failure. While Julian was busy moving into his house, ordering expensive Italian leather sofas, and posting photos of my father's antique clock collection on social media with captions about family legacy, I was in the quiet sanctuary of my office, surrounded by digital archives and bank statements. My first move was to contact Sarah Jenkins, a forensic document examiner who had spent 30 years testifying in federal fraud cases. I provided her with the forged will and 24 samples of my father's genuine signature from the last decade. I also included a few practice scribbles I'd found in a notebook Julian had left in the guest room. David, this isn't even a high-quality forgery, Sarah told me over a secure line. The pen pressure is too consistent for a man with motor skill degradation, but more importantly, the hesitation marks at the curves of the letters prove it was drawn, not written. Your father's hand didn't move like this. But the signature was just the top-line entry. I began a deep-dive audit into the cash flow of the last 6 months of my father's life. Julian had been acting as Dad's errand boy on the days I was tied up with firm business. I pulled the records for my father's primary credit card, the one he thought was only being used for groceries and medications. There they were, 22 documented instances of lifestyle adjustments, $1,400 at a high-end steakhouse in Cincinnati, $3,200 at a boutique hotel in Cleveland, $900 for medical supplies that turned out to be a luxury watch purchase. Julian had been billing his failures to a dying man, operating under the assumption that once the forged will was filed, his tracks would be buried under the inheritance. He didn't realize that I am a man who tracks every cent. I didn't just have the bank statements, I had the digital receipts and time-stamped surveillance footage from the stores. But the final structural support for my case was hidden in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank on High Street. My father had given me the key months ago, with a simple instruction. Open this only after the final tick of the clock. Inside was the original untampered with will, along with a handwritten letter. The real will didn't leave the house to Julian. It placed the entire estate into a restrictive trust, managed by me, designed to provide Julian with a modest allowance only if he remained debt-free and gainfully employed. I had the original. I had the forgery report. I had the evidence of elderly financial exploitation. Julian thought he was standing on the balcony of a palace. I knew he was standing on a trapdoor, and I was finally ready to pull the lever. The final market correction did not take place in a fit of rage or a dramatic confrontation in my father's sunroom. It happened in a sterile, white-walled conference room at the Franklin County Courthouse, under the cold glow of fluorescent lights. Julian arrived early, sporting a new gold watch, one I recognized instantly from the medical supply charges I'd audited, and a look of supreme confidence that was practically a structural failure of his character. He sat at the head of the mahogany table like he was the newly appointed CEO of our father's memory. I sat across from him with a single blue manila folder. No lawyers, no fanfare, just the raw data. When the probate judge, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years of seeing through lies, asked if there were any objections to the will Julian had filed, I didn't stand up and scream. Instead, I stood up and handed a copy of my forensic report to the court. "Your Honor," I said, my voice as steady as a fixed-rate mortgage. "Before we finalize this entry, I'd like the court to review a few material discrepancies. We have a certified forensic report on the signature of the will in question. We have 22 documented instances of financial exploitation against a terminally ill dependent. And," I paused, looking Julian directly in his eyes, which were now widening in shock, "we have the original notarized will discovered in a safe deposit box, dated 3 months before the alleged forgery." I watched Julian's face move through the stages of a total market crash. The arrogance didn't just fade, it evaporated, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out version of the brother I once knew. He looked at his lawyer, then at the folder, his hands beginning to shake. It was the look of a man who realized that while he was playing a cheap game of creative accounting, I had been conducting a full-scale, professional audit of his life. The judge spent 15 minutes in absolute silence reading the documents. When she finally looked up, her expression was like granite. She didn't just invalidate Julian's forged will. She immediately referred the evidence to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The house Julian thought he'd stolen was legally returned to the trust I managed, and his access to every family asset was severed by a court order that took less than 60 seconds to sign. "David, come on," Julian whispered as the bailiffs began clearing the room. "We're brothers. You can't do this." "We are brothers, Julian," I replied, standing up. "But a ledger has to balance. You made too many unauthorized withdrawals, and now the bill is due in full. Figure it out." I walked out into the Ohio sun. The market had corrected itself. The bad debt was finally written off. Closing the books on a life isn't just about the final distribution of assets. It's about ensuring the narrative remains honest. My father's clocks are still ticking in the house on Maplewood Drive, their steady rhythm a reminder that truth is a constant, even when someone tries to manipulate the dial. Julian is facing the legal consequences of his own fraudulent entries, finally learning that you can't build a future on a forged foundation. In my world, integrity is the only asset that doesn't depreciate over time. I'm back in my office, tracking the numbers and the truths, knowing the ledger is finally balanced. If you believe that loyalty and honesty deserve a legacy, hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories of accountability and justice. Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your books clean.